The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was fought to preserve the Northern and Southern way of life. Because of the way their economies were at the time, this battle inevitably became centered around slavery. The Southern states had a labor-intensive agricultural society, growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and most profitably, cotton. The Northern states had an economy based on manufacturing and commerce, becoming increasingly mechanized. This later made it easier for them to manufacture weapons and provide their troops with supplies. Events like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, propaganda like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, the Dred Scott case, John Brown's raid, and finally, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 led to sectionalist tensions that grew to a point where they could not be ignored. The Northern states called themselves the Union. They were led by President Lincoln and believed in strong federal rights. The Southern states called themselves the Confederate States of America and were led by Jefferson Davis. They believed in strong individual states' rights.
In January 1861, the South secedes. The first state to secede was South Carolina, followed by Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The blue was the Union and the white is the Union territories. Attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 in Charleston, North Carolina. The Confederate forces bombarded the Union's fort, causing the Union to surrender, and this event started the Civil War. The first Battle of Bull Run was in July 1861. It was the first major land battle, and the Union troops began to retreat to Washington, D.C. This led to a Confederate victory. On January 27, 1862, President Lincoln issues a war order. September to October 1862 was the Battle of Antietam. George McClellan was a Union general and Robert E. Lee was a Confederate general. It was the bloodiest battle of the war, and it ended the Confederacy's campaign in Maryland. It was the first major battle on Union soil, and it gave opportunity for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Confederate lost this war. The Emancipation Proclamation made abolishing slavery one of the goals of the war. In April to July 1863 was Vicksburg's campaign. Grant was a general for the Union versus Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy. They moved inland and drove the Confederacy into defensive lines, causing the Confederacy to split into two. In June to July was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the turning point of the war. It drove the Confederacy out of the North, and the Gettysburg Address in November 1863 redefined the Civil War. It made slavery a goal of the war, and it discussed the principle of human equality as well as the struggle to preserve the Union. Sherman's march begins in August 1864. It burns down Confederate infrastructure, crops, livestock. They began to try to capture Atlanta and continued marching to the sea, causing destruction to the South on the way to the sea. The fall of the Confederacy was in January 1865. It was caused by transportation problems, food and supply shortages, and the burning down of Richmond. Sherman's march continued until February 1865. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant, thus ending the Civil War. President Lincoln was assassinated 6 days later at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. Before shooting Lincoln, he said, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning thus always to tyrants. The end.